I remember it quite well, actually. At least I think I do. Of course, I've made an effort to remember it. I've cultivated it, returned to it, conveyed it to others on occasion. I think it possible I don't really remember it at all, as it actually occurred. But I recall my memory of it, and with it the pleasure it evoked, though on occasion I may be accused of embellishing certain details and repressing others, until the latter were lost and the former retained, reviewed, and disseminated, until they too became as much a part of the story as anything that actually happened. I can't say exactly how I felt as it all transpired, but I can say, and I'm certain of this and can assure you, however far the facts may deviate from my given story, that here I remain stubbornly attached to an absolute truth, that I am intimately aware of how recalling this part of my life feels. For while the specific emotion has changed, the impulse to remember has remained remarkably consistent, for reasons I should hope soon to articulate, if only implicitly. And of course I am, right now, reliving it once more, so you would find it difficult to contend that such an experience was not fresh in my mind. I am going to tell you about the time I was happy. Or rather, I should rephrase that rather ominous hook, for I am pleased to say that in my, yes, long, life, happiness has not confined itself to a few fleeting moments in a faraway youth. I'm happy right now, actually, and I hope the camera catches that. But that's your job, not mine, and I won't worry myself over your aesthetic decisions, or my own performance. I've done this before many times, and while they were all private affairs, I should think myself capable of, at the very least, feigning intimacy long enough to convey to you a story which, if I haven't already made it clear, I rather long to tell, in general, and specifically to those who've never heard it before. It isn't the most original tale. The characters are all familiar, though perhaps the setting's a bit novel. Ultimately, I place the burden upon the two of us, you more than me, frankly, to illustrate or, once again, articulate to those it may concern that indeed it should concern them, if not delight or elucidate or any other more becoming verb. For really, all I can do is speak, clearly and thoroughly, for as long as it may take, and hope that you find it worthwhile to continue with my voice, and augment or refine it as you see fit until our own two stories are one, at which point they'll further procreate with and amidst the not insignificant audience you promised me when I agreed to this. I can't be certain of what they'll get out of it. I know what I'm receiving, at least, and while I admittedly don't really need it, I confess to having always possessed a certain weakness for large sums of cash. But I do hope, if nothing else, that we not waste anyone's time, for if there's one thing I'm certain of, and if you can pardon the truism, which will hopefully be my last, it's that this is the only thing they can't get back. Scarcity, of course, has always been a factor in worth, but it's hardly profound of me to suggest that to most, time only gains value once its depletion is made evident. And it is at these moments when that most terrible symptom of self-awareness, regret, asserts its presence most thoroughly, and demands even more of what we have less to give. Forgive my bluntness, and I suppose arrogance as well, as I tell you that I have long since left regret behind, at least in this particular instance, and indeed am rather happy for how things turned out, not so much because I no longer wonder about what might have been, but rather that this too is accompanied by a fondness for what did happen, and, if you'll again pardon my hubris, for I'm really not that old, what is still to come. I look back, so to speak, all those years ago on a city that is in many ways unchanged today, and I recall, if not the exact chain of events, then select moments which I have consciously or unconsciously desired to retain, and with them certain feelings either too general to repeat or too specific to articulate, and while I do regret that my own personal lexicon, if not the English language itself, fails me at this moment, I take some, perhaps, unearned pride in imagining my own experience as entirely unique to myself. But this is all a rather boring prelude to the actual story, and I'm afraid I wouldn't indulge myself with it if I didn't think it likely that I may not have the chance to do so again. You are, of course, free to use what you wish in the end, but I think I have to clarify a few things, with myself if no one else, before I truly begin. So permit me another rhetorical question as I ask at just what age one stops being a youth. I suppose it's dependent on context. I can say without any doubt that I was still very much a youth, insomuch as I wasn't anything else, when this all happened many years ago. Toronto was Toronto, which is to say that it was hot and dry, though hardly as crowded as it is now, and in certain parts of the city one struggled to identify a certifiably green plant. A brittle brown dominated the landscape, and truth be told, I would privately disdain those few green lawns I did encounter, both for their monochrome symmetry, so self-righteously pure amidst the spotted plots of their less assertive neighbors, and for the terrible conclusion I had no choice but to draw about their owners' water consumption. Well, I was not the wallflower I may appear as at times in this story, or have been typecast as since, and while I can hardly say I admire the girl who so quickly looked down on her, and I quote, bourgeois companions for their deference to floral manicuring, I take some glib pride in the fact that that headstrong and foolish young woman was ultimately right. Now, during the summer I didn't work much, or rather was rarely officially employed, and indeed in this particular off-season, that's a sports metaphor, I suppose, I found myself terribly free to do as I pleased whenever I felt like it. A most enviable position, you'd agree. Would it surprise you to know that what I pleased to do most was stay in my room and stare forward at my personal computer? It wouldn't surprise anyone my age, since they were doing the same, and you in your own generation have your variations on it as well. I confess to having never quite figured it out. The internet, that is. Obviously, I understood how to use it. I wasn't spastically mashing the keyboard in futile approximation of my technological betters. But I can't say I ever quite figured out the appeal entirely, and as you might imagine, this problem has only increased over the years. On the plus side, unlike some of my contemporaries, modern technology hardly makes me feel old, since I've already attained the decades of experience necessary to cloak my ignorance in appealing anachronism. Anyway, hip young reactionary that I was, personally, not politically, though I recognize that in some circumstances the difference is negligible, I have vowed to detach myself from the computer and venture out on a near-daily basis into the so-called real world. Again, this is not as difficult as it seems. Does it sound difficult? I suppose not, nor should it really. I feel my tone may be confusing, for obviously it wasn't very difficult, considering again how little I had actually committed to the internet and its various tools, and also the fact that I had arms and legs and all sorts of other useful appendages. So I would go out, at least a few times a week, in the middle of the day or at night, and walk, usually for a few hours at least. Sometimes I'd affix a goal to my walk: pick up milk, return library books or DVDs, visit someone, although I'm afraid this last one wasn't very common. It was very hot that year, as I think I already mentioned, and so retaining viable dairy products on such a day justified reappraising my experience as a journey. A goal then becomes a quest, and I apply to my past an almost mythological grandeur. But mostly I just walked. Anywhere. For reasons both economic and temporal, it was usually restricted to my immediate neighborhood, extended somewhat by the rather impressive pace and lengthy duration of a number of these excursions, though if I found myself downtown, for example, I would often indulge in a casual stroll. On occasion I even transported myself to a specific location for the sole purpose of then exploring it on foot. Sometimes I brought along a camera, or my cell phone, and photographed whatever caught my attention that day. I preferred video, to be honest, even though it slowed me down. I think with video, or film, what's the accepted term nowadays? Oh, it doesn't matter. I think with video or film or whatever, you can do something that you can't do with a still image. You can show change. Of course, you can see change in photographs as well, one from this year, one from the next, and so on, all lined up next to each other or presented in some sort of slideshow as one person ages laterally or becomes another person or a house or a landscape. But you can't, I guess I shouldn't generalize, but anyway, you can't do that with a single still image. I think if anything, you're obliterating change by removing its one true constant, time. And while any sort of circumscribed cinematic representation of the world, my own amateur recordings very much included, perhaps invariably fails to present change in anything but a teleological manner, even with this caveat, I find my own beliefs philosophically defensible, since I think you'll find very few people whose lives don't prove teleological in the end. And either way, these particular anomalies are probably more of a concern for scientists and theologians than they are for either of us. What I liked about filming, though, was not so much the end product. I'm not a filmmaker and frankly have no patience for it or most other artistic endeavors, since I rarely did anything with the footage anyway beyond archiving it on my hard drive. What I found, though, and what I truly came to appreciate, was the act of looking, as disreputable as this sounds, at the people around me, my fellow Torontonians, if you will. I found that if I placed the camera down in a public location, and since the suburbs rarely satiated my flânery, and I was afraid that if I pointed my camera at someone's house they would rightfully call the police on me, I was usually in a public location, and zoomed out and framed the shot and kind of just left it on for a while, I would begin to form an even greater appreciation of everything around me. There are a lot of things in the world, and while I'm reluctant to extrapolate so-called universals from my own personal experience, I think most people would agree that inevitably it's hard to, or even impossible or dangerous, what with cars and all, to try to notice everything around you. When filming, though, and particularly when setting up the shot so that it at the very least proved pleasing to me, and perhaps me only, I found myself concentrating on every little detail. Where people were sitting or standing or walking or driving, what they were wearing or doing or even thinking, what the roads or buildings or street signs looked like, in effect what the city was saying and its residents were saying to it. Because the two go together, obviously. I think I'm slipping into truisms again. As one builds the other, though which one's one and which one's other isn't particularly important here. Filming banal scenes of public discourse allowed me to focus my attention on lives in the act of living, though I fear in saying that I'm giving the impression that I have, with divine sagacity, extracted myself from anything so common as the daily, and indeed had that been the case I surely would have something to regret. But I don't think that was the case. I mention all of this because, though by the end of the summer I had fully committed to filming that which I encountered on my walks, I had, for reasons I don't recall and probably weren't important, chosen to bring my still camera along this time. Perhaps it was because I was not in public anymore, but rather in one of Toronto's few remaining ravines. Here there was green and graffiti, and forgive me if I say that I preferred the latter, though both are quite rare nowadays. I had gone, in other words, where people in the city go when they want to get away from other people, and though I can't quite say what motivated me to do this, you will see that I even failed in this regard. But for a while I contented myself with the many virtues, aesthetic or otherwise, of metropolitan plant life. Grasses, trees, shrubs, and bushes, leaves mostly, I suppose, and flowers, small and wild. I'm not a botanist, and wasn't then. Birds and insects, a lot of nice close-ups of ants and bumblebees and the like. I probably still have some of those pictures, though where I couldn't say. Not that they were particularly great images, washed out and overexposed or hazy and dry, or both. They already looked older than they were. But even so, you could tell that they wouldn't have amounted to much had they been taken under better conditions, the quality of the photographer very much excluded. Lots of shallow focus. I suppose I was truly committed to removing the park from the surrounding city. That and bugs are small. They rather demand a longer lens, at least if you have any intention of seeing them. Flowers, too, and blades of grass. Scale dictated most of my aesthetic choices that day, as it probably did on most. Trees are altogether too large to truly photograph, and are thereby relegated to landscapes or any other geographical taxonomy. They're backgrounded by virtue of being bigger than everything else around them, which effectively left me with pine cones and dead leaves and incrementally approaching heat stroke. But you make the best of what you get, if you'll pardon my appropriation of the second person. And certainly there were many days when I roamed the city proper with little tactile to show for my results. I mean, it was all digital, actually, when I filmed. So there wasn't really anything tactile to begin with, but I could always burn the footage onto a DVD, which you can hold if nothing else, while I could hardly do the same to no footage at all. But it was a nice day, and I don't regret, well, that's redundant, as I got this story out of it. I didn't regret going at the time. I've always liked the city, generically, the populous archetype, because it's the only place where I feel like I can truly be alone. So many indifferent people provide a perfect cover for introspection. Who has the time to worry about me when there are so many others to serve as distraction? Parks are like that too, I think, only more so. It's not like the trees are going to reach out to me if I start coughing, and frankly, I'd be even more worried if they did. Sentient plant life is a frightening proposition. I'm digressing again. You really must stop me next time. It's not that I'm devoted to, let's say, linearity, but I do hold some preference for being interesting, and I'm afraid I may not have maintained that standard with each narrative offshoot. So suddenly, I was making my way through the dense foliage, occasionally amusing myself by hacking about errant branches with my left arm as if it were then transformed into the requisite machete of the jungle imperialist. Or maybe I was bored. Does the fact that I turned so quickly to my rather corrupted imagination suggest to you that I found the great outdoors lacking? Or did its many virtues simply propel me into a sustained state of creative self-indulgence? Did I mention I was using film that day? That is, within my camera was a roll of 35mm film stock of Kodak or Agfa or one of the other brands of the time. This is an important detail, and I assure you that I wouldn't mention it if it didn't prove relevant to the story later on. Yes, there is a story, or an overarching narrative of some sort, and with a little patience we'll get there eventually. Now, each roll of film had approximately 36 individual images on it, or would if I could ever load it properly. Unfortunately, my own clumsiness, combined with a pathological fear of corrupting an entire roll through improper implementation, led me to waste a number of images before I'd even closed the camera again. So in fact, I rarely had more than 31 or 32 pictures per roll, and that's not taking into account the number of photographs that were even good, or some crude approximation thereof, maybe 3 to 5 under my own very loose and indulgent standards. Good, aesthetically that is, evoking some kind of intuitively objective evaluative criterion. Over time, of course, even, or perhaps even especially, those most banal images, along with their casually tossed-off contemporaries, proved equally rewarding, for within them I could see change not immediately present then. Here was a tree, now there's an apartment. This neighborhood was full of Vietnamese immigrants. She married too young and divorced too late. Unaffected artlessness, or more accurately, feeble artistry, resulted in a record of the past more revelatory than any image I could actually construct. And while this may say more about my talent as a photographer than it does the nature of memory, or any such ambitious inquiry, I cherish the now somewhat faded impulse that led to their production, if not the execution that accompanied it. But what about me? I was asked that question fairly often, since I rarely appeared in, or rather was rarely the apparent subject of, any of my photographs, and insects are always ephemeral, at least by human standards, so one can hardly be expected to mourn the loss of any individually catalogued anthill. So when queried on the subject, "Why aren't you in any of your pictures?"
I would inevitably respond to the questioner's briefly piqued interest that I was in fact in all of my photographs. I was the one behind the camera. I then probably smirked, at least internally and often externally as well. Nevertheless, the statement was and remains at the very least literally true, and certainly literal truth is better than no truth at all. Some might contend that it's the best kind of truth, though I confess that such debates bore me, and frankly I'm quite disappointed in myself for bringing it up, fearing as I do that it might derail consideration of my story's other virtues. Either way, or regardless of one's philosophical position, I certainly was the woman behind the camera that day, trudging through dry Torontonian park flora in search of anything that might catch my interest, and by this point 20 or so photographs had expired in my desperate attempt to produce what I had not yet found. The vague permanence, and with it not insignificantly the added expense, of using actual film stock always forced me to discriminate more thoroughly in my choice of imagery than when I filmed digitally, and so every actual image required a certain intellectual commitment, accompanied by a financial commitment of about 19 cents a click. Thusly did each individual photograph provoke that feeling of pride that inevitably follows the beginning of any commitment, to be replaced, unfortunately, with fear and apprehension after a certain duration, no shorter than a moment's contemplation and no longer than the roll of film. And while it may appear assuaged at the sight of development, it was often but a minor displacement, as all photographers soon discover that every bad picture looks better in negative, and always will so long as black sky proves a strange sight during the day.
Now, I had found myself with little to show for my work that day, and in veiled frustration I expressed this by taking more and more photographs of seemingly unworthy objects, or more accurately, simply taking unworthy photographs, and I exhausted my first roll of film rather quickly. Likewise did I make my way through a second and most of a third roll, when I came upon a small river, or a creek. "Rivers are beautiful," I exclaimed rather loudly to no one in particular. I think the statement holds true to the point where I should have hardly felt embarrassed had I known anyone to hear it. But I was alone, or rather by myself, and set about to photograph this river in a manner that captured what I no doubt considered the eternal beauty of flowing water, with little consideration as to how hard it was to actually show flow in a still image. I realize as I speak how peculiar the thought of a river in Toronto must sound, but such bodies of water were, while arguably endangered, certainly not extinct at the time. There were a few remaining, although they were almost all limited in their above-ground appearances to parkland, and even then they were never the most prominently featured element of the landscape. Before my time, quite a while actually, Toronto had many rivers, but as the city expanded they were filled in with garbage or diverted into oblivion or otherwise buried underground, where some remain today. Our sewage system interacts and often appropriates many of these old creeks, and while in some ways this seems like a truly ennoble fate for a once proud stream, the adjective justified in so much as all hydrological bodies are often construed as proud, regardless of their own feelings in the matter or apparent acquiescence in the face of human development, I should think sanitation work better than not existing at all, and no doubt quite important, if you'll pardon the anthrocentric offshoot. But anyway, as I mentioned, having not truly considered the prospect before, I failed to recognize at first the difficulty inherent in photographing water. The river was fast, its concrete banks ensured this, and it was sunny, so I could count on a fast shutter speed. But really, what good would that do? I'd capture the river in motion, a moment in its movement. But what's a moment to a river? All the appeal of a river, well, what I think to be its appeal, lies in its motion, in the sound it makes as it rushes forward to its next destination, colliding with rocks and plants and other felled trees all the while. This is no more apparent with a slower shutter speed. Then it's just a great blur, and that's rather dishonest, since the water was nothing if not clear. So at first I settled on all the other interesting things around the river. Frogs and dragonflies and rotting wood, interesting plants or little whirlpools formed along the banks, which I figured must produce exciting patterns invisible in the moment but perfectly perceptible to my camera. There weren't many of those, though, at least here, because the concrete barrier prevented the erosion necessary to produce them. But still, there were other things to be seen if you looked closely and could handle the mosquitoes. I hadn't worn bug spray. A perfectly rational fear of carcinogens justified that decision, so naturally I was beset by mosquitoes throughout the day, and, not to belabor the metaphor, their bites lingered on long after I abandoned my vow to never set foot in a park again. If I moved enough, I could avoid them. Well, not really, but I thought that way at the time, and at the very least, if I was moving quickly, I likely had some sort of goal in mind, if only to go forward, and so if a mosquito attached itself to me, I would hardly notice it. When I stopped moving, though, to frame a picture or tie my shoes, or just to stop and take a moment to compose my thoughts, I could see and hear them gathering around me, landing on my legs and arms and gorging themselves on my blood. I've always had delicious blood, you see, and its consumption was so severe then that I'm surprised I had any left by the end of the day. After some time, I don't know how much precisely, but it couldn't have been too long, I had exhausted my third roll, and not yet willing to admit defeat, I set about installing a fourth. By now, though, I had been outdoors for a few hours in the sun, which was hot, as the sun often is, and I hadn't had much to drink. I should probably have something to drink now, actually, and even with the ample shade, I was beginning to feel the effects of this.
I was tired, I suppose, as one is, or at least I was, and still am, after spending a lot of time in the sun, and having trouble concentrating as I attempted to unload the finished roll and replace it with another. It's not a complicated process, but I always had trouble with it, as the new roll failed to spool properly or wasn't tight enough, and I was so afraid of improperly installing it that I would do it over and over again until I was absolutely sure it was completely in, and the first 6 images had been ruined. I was moving especially slowly, too, as the heat ensured my sloth, and doing so without any thought whatsoever. Or rather, loading that film was my only thought, a strong, purposeful goal so direct and immediate as to eliminate the need for any other, and so easy to accomplish as to guarantee reward and self-satisfaction upon completion. Perhaps I was making a spectacle of myself, a sunburnt girl, young woman, as I would have insisted you call me at the time, struggling valiantly to thread film into an old camera down by a mostly abandoned river in the middle of the day. I might very well have been cursing. I was pretty sure I was alone, so it didn't matter. At the very least, I acted as if I were alone. And then in some sense I acted selfishly, as if I were sure I would remain alone, and needn't any longer consider my effect on others. I didn't see him at first, and when I did, I didn't really. I looked up and right at the sun, which seemed odd, since it was the sudden shadow that first drew my attention, but my eyes adjusted to the light, or the wind blew a branch in its way, and I could see quite clearly now, though still I wondered what I was looking at. A person, of course, or a man, obviously, which in and of itself isn't too noteworthy, indeed quite the opposite, though I couldn't help but feel that I knew him, even if I failed to identify who he was or why I might feel this way. We seemed about the same age, so I assumed he must have been a classmate or a casual acquaintance, or at least someone I'd encountered at school, if only passing in the library or down a hallway. But he seemed more familiar than that, or at least he acted more familiar, as if certain he knew me, and for the time being I felt somewhat embarrassed that I couldn't place the same comfort in our meeting as he did. And then he spoke, and it all came back to me. I can't be faulted for not recognizing him at first, for it had been a number of years since we'd last seen each other, 4 or 5, I believe, though the exact number doesn't matter. In that time we hadn't spoken much, or really at all, and evidently I had not kept track of his appearance. He had changed a lot, I think, though to be honest I don't remember, and probably didn't then either, precisely what he looked like when I had last seen him. But I hadn't forgotten him, and he certainly hadn't forgotten me, and evidently felt himself something of an expert in film loading, and he proved just as incompetent as I was, if not more so, though the gesture was nice, and eventually the camera was properly loaded. It was a moot point now, though, for of course there were more pressing matters to attend to, and we began to talk. Positioning ourselves around the water, appropriating rotten logs and shapely dirt as makeshift chairs, we went about struggling to discover an acceptable topic to begin on. "How are you?" inevitably led things off, as it's an inoffensive icebreaker, albeit mildly disingenuous, as most small talk is. It demonstrates familiarity without demanding a sincere response, as few truly hope to receive an answer more challenging than, "Fine, and how are you?" We were both fine, though, and so we could further the conversation through solicitations and expositions on just why we were so fine, and what actions had led to us being so fine. Minor accomplishments, loose aspirations, relatable grievances, and the like followed, accompanied at times by slight reminiscences and warm laughter. Not that either of us were particularly funny, or acting in a funny manner, but the situation itself, suffused with contrivance, seemed to warrant it, if only as an inarticulate acknowledgment of the rather strange circumstance surrounding our meeting. And while it was nervous laughter, or nervous smiles, they were all sincere and well-earned, and frequent enough to confirm that we had not lost our friendship, but simply displaced it. And if it was slightly rusty and creaky from infrequent use, then surely nothing could better lubricate it than a quiet day in the park. After a while, or maybe only a few minutes, we decided to start walking again around the river, or rather by it, to the extent that such a path could be maintained. I did most of the speaking, which I figured justifiable, as I considered myself to be a very interesting person, and knew no better way of proving this than through its constant vocal assertion. The topics were broad and digressive. Something about the camera led into a discussion of expenses, and so we compared the cost of our studies and concluded that both were far too great. Flora and fauna alike inspired rumination on past travel, where comparable plants and animals were seen. I think I mentioned the Blue Jays, perhaps after spotting a cardinal, who were having a very disappointing season that year. In person, cardinals are far more impressive than Blue Jays, and the same was true in baseball as well. But black and white tends to nullify the difference, and anyway I mostly stopped taking pictures for the rest of the day. I could have photographed him, I suppose, but it never seemed appropriate. Or anyway, I didn't want to. We were having fun as it was, and stopping to pose by the river or a particularly gnarly tree so that we might have proof of this later struck me as pointless, and still all these years after I feel the same way. Eventually we made our way down to another part of the river where concrete gave way to more natural banks and the whole thing proved considerably more accessible. It might be said to have been more beautiful here, at least if one conflates nature with beauty, and while in many ways I did prefer this part of the river, I also missed the crude graffiti one found down along the concrete riverbanks. I think you have to admire the will of those who produce these works, maneuvering through tall grass and hanging branches or down steep hills, or even across the river itself, often just to sign their name or insignia or leave a small note for whoever drops by next. Or maybe they're just claiming the space for themselves, making a part of the park definitively theirs, as now no one else may paint over it or deny that this other person got there first. There isn't any other reward for it, at least beyond the knowledge that it's done, but these accomplishments are often the most pleasing, and apparently lacking wherever the river was allowed to claim agency for itself. We found a small pathway, or something like it, carved out by others equally eager to get a closer view of the water, and climbed down it. It wasn't really much different than it was before, but sitting on concrete does make one feel somewhat exposed, as does the large bridge overhead and the private houses nearby. Here the greater overgrowth and the plentiful shade at least offered the impression of seclusion, and it was here that we decided to have something of a picnic. It was very light on food. I rarely ate much on my walks, finding it to be too much of a distraction, so I only had a bottle of water and a few warm grapes on me. He didn't have much more, his own water and a granola bar, but so long as we ate something and offered each other something else, we could call it a picnic and amuse ourselves with our self-consciously quaint affectations. We didn't actually share anything. I ate my grapes very quickly, and though he too had finished his water shortly after he sat down, and was quite evidently thirsty, he refused a drink of mine, citing dubious medical reasons, which I might have taken as an insult if I didn't feel, perhaps incorrectly, that he was more kindly deferring the drink to me should I need it later. Either way, we spent all of about 3 minutes picnicking, and at least twice as long deprecating our decision to picnic. Insincere deprecation that quite obviously doubled as very sincere flirting, or at least I felt that way, and I figure he did too. There really isn't much else to do by a river. We couldn't very well fish. Actually, I don't think the Don River had any fish. I don't remember seeing any, which is hardly proof. But we did spend a lot of time by it that day, and I returned a number of times afterward, and never can I recall seeing a fish within it. If fish can withstand Lake Ontario, where an errant seagull is liable to burst into flames upon glazing the water, then surely some hardier species could have made its home here. But as I said, there were no fish to my recollection. Only a few frogs and insects, and as always mosquitoes, which I realize are insects too. But we kept talking, and I do believe I noted the absence of fish, and he dared me to touch the water, as if that were a particularly difficult act, and it was cold. Surprisingly so, or rather I didn't anticipate it being cold, though in hindsight it was to be expected. And truthfully, it couldn't have been very clean, otherwise there would have been fish, you see. But it's not as though I licked my fingers afterward, and we had already eaten. I wiped them on my shirt, I suppose, or my shorts, and I didn't go in again.
And then what happened?
Well, that's really personal, I think. The details are immaterial and possibly criminal, though no one seemed to care then and probably wouldn't now. It was a logical place to end the day, and soon after we parted. We made our way back up to the main path and walked together for a while longer, somewhat less animated than before, and eventually we concluded, truthfully or not, that we were heading in opposite directions and said goodbye, though we assured each other that we would see each other again sometime in the near future, and this promise did hold up, at least initially.
Would you care to elaborate?
Yes, certainly. I had a few shots left on my camera, and took them rather haphazardly on the road home, preferring as I did then to keep my rolls homogeneous, as a rather lazy alternative to thorough record-keeping. But now they could be developed, and for all I knew I had stumbled across an interesting image, if not today then later, and either way I wouldn't know until I saw the negatives.
And even then.
And even then. Animals are always interesting, as the internet had proven, so a few close-ups of birds and dragonflies appeared somewhat worthwhile. I only had myself to blame when others of the like captured their subjects inaccurately, which is to say dully, which is to say I had a few misshapen blurs in imitation of frogs and ferns to call my own as well. But anyway, they were developed and filed away, and I made a few prints here and there, but mostly the negatives remained untouched and stored in a binder somewhere in a cardboard box in my garage. And that's an aphorism of sorts. I've kept all my negatives rather well, in cool places, properly laminated, and handled them with as much care as I could, though dust and hairs and scratches were an inevitability I often welcomed. The negatives from that day, though, are probably in perfect condition, or as near to perfect as can be, and that's never a good sign. An old negative, or a photograph, or a film, and I mean really old in all of these instances, things with tangible reference, in excellent condition is rarely a photograph or film of great worth, aesthetic worth at least. Their impeccable preservation belies an almost flagrant disregard for their use. No one cared about them or valued them or even liked them, and often they weren't very good anyway, so they hardly suffered the pains of time and use. Now, a weathered photograph or film, consumed by dust and scratches or creases and further decayed by time and frequent consultation, announces its worth, or simply implies it, for here was something that at the very least one person truly valued, enough that its future preservation was always sacrificed in favor of its present use. There are more people before any worn-out film than there are within it, and to recognize that, I think, is not to diminish the work of those who made it, but to value all the more the service their actions performed. But this isn't always the case, of course. A worn-out photograph might be worn out because it was bad, or because it fell in the mud, or for reasons entirely unrelated to how much someone cared for it, or the right person never saw a picture, and it was terminated before they could, or because someone did care about it until circumstances intervened. And this whole conversation is rather archaic, if not archaeological, because you never could quite get the same effect with computers. You have compression, of course, though that's less of a problem now. But here it was always more of an either-or situation, as in you either have the negative or you don't. It didn't take me long to realize back then that a scratched negative was always preferable to a corrupted memory card. I don't want to make this a referendum on the present, or complain about things that had already happened when I was young, and understandably only continued to do so thereafter. It's easy enough to valorize the past, and only more so when the past in question precedes your own presence in it. Photographs help, obviously, but the world wasn't black and white, even if it always looked that way. People wore color and lived among color, and possessed considerably sharper facial features than many photographs would suggest. At the very least, they typically avoided high contrast. So if I ever sound nostalgic, know that it's tempered, I hope, by a tacit understanding that what I really want is what I really want, or wanted, and is not to be taken as anything more than a personal preference entirely free of didacticism, however wise it may be, of course, for others to follow it. For nostalgia is a texture, really, a dull emotion in constant reference to a rhetorical past, an abbreviated what-if, briefly lingering, pleasing in its own unavailability, if ever indulgent for the same reason. I do wonder on occasion what could have been had one of us put more effort into the other that summer. I can't help it, and I don't think it's so wrong. And in its own peculiar way, it makes me feel happy. But I don't regret anything either, or at least I haven't for quite some time now. If I did, I doubt I'd tell you about it. So we saw each other here and there, not every day or every week, but frequently enough, and I always looked forward to these meetings, and I hope he did too. We probably could have seen more of each other, but why be greedy, I figured, or at least excused myself with later. These were hardly the most exciting visits, at least from a third party's perspective. They were loosely structured around walks downtown or uptown or simply around, and sometimes at exhibits or cafes or whatever else caught our eye that day. I'm not sure they're worth spending much time on. Despite being in a perpetual state of arousal, Toronto's not the most romantic city, then or now, and it hardly seems meaningful to recount which defunct restaurants we frequented, or what particular exhibit then occupied the basement of the Royal Ontario Museum. Likewise, Lake Ontario, a literal cesspool, or giant carcinogen, is not itself conducive to a waterside rendezvous, and really most of downtown was under construction that year, or every year really, but it was quite prominent then. The Royal York Hotel demanded further modernization, I suppose, or something, and a number of new apartment buildings followed suit, and always someone talked about revitalizing the downtown core, and always they evidently failed to do so, or the process took so long that by the time it was completed it was already in need of another revitalization. But I'm not complaining, at least not about the impulse behind it. Asking everything to stay the same is rather pointless and selfish, as if everything existed to serve my desire. Would that it did. Or yours, or anyone else's. Preferably mine, of course, but the point stands regardless of whom it's applied to. We both had too much free time, and could always spend an extra hour together when necessary, though I, on occasion, limply protested so as to give the impression that my time was in great demand. Once he believed me, or called my bluff, and from then on I thought it best to practice a genuine sincerity, or at least affect one, lest I be stuck in the middle of nowhere or Dufferin. At the very least I knew better now than to fake an appointment on public transit. Here something occurred to me, of dubious relevance, but if you don't mind, I'd like to recount the anecdote, or amusing observation, or whatever it might be classified as. I used to spend a lot of time along Bathurst, all of it, south and north of Bloor alike, and there was one particular area that always amused me. Not so much that I'd say, hey, want to check out Bathurst with me? But of course I never said that about any place, so the point is debatable. Anyway, on Bathurst, around Lawrence, I believe, was a rather large Orthodox Jewish community, and accordingly there were a number of stores and the like meant to serve their specific needs. Kosher groceries and comically right-wing newspapers and other things like that. But what I found so amusing, and really what the purpose of this anecdote is, was the unwarranted proliferation of Jewish tombstone stores found along this small strip of Toronto. Not one, not two, but 3 independent entities, each offering its presumably limited clientele something the other apparently could not. I can understand one such store existing, as indeed it served a definite if rather unpleasant need to the community, and perhaps too on the assumption that one's prices could be undercut or its product improved. But a third seems entirely gratuitous, as if the owner, looking to get into the niche afterlife business, performed the necessary research and divined that more Jewish tombstones were sold on this block than anywhere else in Toronto, and thusly concluded that this was the best place to establish his business. I always wondered which one made the most sales, though I figured it wasn't the store offering tickets to Rock of Ages along with each custom-made monument.
I think it best if we return to the story at hand.
Oh, yes, well, you would, wouldn't you? But it's my story, and I don't think I've ever told it all the way through without some sort of digression. You wouldn't want me to just rotely recite it like I was reading from a manuscript of my own past. But no, you're right to some extent. We do only have so much time. So where was I?
You were discussing your
Oh,
time.
heavens, it was a rhetorical question. We saw each other throughout the summer, and I, enjoyed it immensely. People always speak about sensing a connection, of possessing some kind of indescribable feeling in these sorts of situations, and I guess you can get away with that kind of literary evasiveness because everyone else knows exactly what you're referring to, and those who don't hopefully will someday. Now, I'm not one for that old cliche, love at first sight. I can't think of anything more preposterous. What is there to even love at first sight? Beyond your own anticipation, that is. I think it a rather self-flattering, if not outright selfish concept, as any such practitioner assumes that he or she has found that perfect someone, who is more specifically perfect for him or her, and of course isn't really perfect at all. It's a desire to be satisfied immediately, by a person who already fits all of your needs and will presumably be willing to do so for as long as you require them. I simply don't believe it appropriate to call such a thing love, and certainly I wouldn't dare fall in love in such a rash manner. I have always instead attempted to preface my romantic affairs with a lengthy acquaintanceship, to truly know, to the best of my ability, whomever I wish to commit my life to, and with, and have in turn a life committed to and with mine. I suppose some might argue that this hasn't worked out very well, but I have no regrets, and I'm certainly not complaining. But while it wasn't love at first sight, or probably love at all, you could tell, or I could tell, that there was enough mutual pleasure in our encounters to warrant more of them. And I wanted it to be love. Not that I was entirely sure what that meant. Bluntly put, as we grew ever more closely acquainted, or rather reacquainted, I came to wish that he felt that way about me, so that my own desire would not seem so foolish or wrong-headed. I wanted in some way, whether explicitly articulated or not, to know that I was committing myself to someone who wanted nothing more than for me to do so, who struggled for sleep because he could not help but wonder when we would see each other next, and when exhaustion overwhelmed him, awoke the next day dismayed to be alone, and cursed his dreams for not providing him with my company. For as much as I might disdain the concept of love at first sight, I truly abhor the idea of a one-sided affair, so I will not say that I loved him, because I think love rather meaningless without reciprocation, and as far as I was aware, and as much as I searched for it, and truly as certain as I am that he enjoyed our time together, I don't believe I ever found it. I don't believe he ever looked back at me and saw what I did in him, or rather saw in me something equivalent to my own silent devotion, and I liked him enough. That's an understatement, and there were a lot of those then too, that I dared not press forward with any assertion or demand that he meet my adoration and raise himself to that level, for I was terribly afraid of corrupting what I already had, and figured it best that only I suffer for it, and maybe I appreciated myself for it, and construed my actions as a commendable sacrifice, and came to enjoy in some way the rare feeling of the living martyr. In truth, I know, that I loved the way I felt. I loved knowing that I could care so much about someone else, that I could care in a way so distinct from any other emotion that I figured it had to be sincere and selfless and eminently respectable, and so as always it might have simply appealed to me as another episode of self-flattery. And on that thought, I loved knowing that I could feel in such a way while harboring the cynical expectation that nothing would ever come of it. Like any romantic, then, I was really in love with failure, with the putatively enviable belief that an opportunity crushed or diverted was more beautiful than one realized. And since he never said otherwise, I could always assume that he felt similarly, and struggled as I did, and that it never went farther than that was only more romantic, and of course I cherished the possibility even more, until it was too much to handle. I suppose that it's worth noting here that we really didn't know each other. Of course we had known each other, that is, known of each other, for almost a decade at the time, and my lapsed recollection notwithstanding, we had not forgotten each other entirely in those intervening years. But that hardly mattered to me, even if I was for the most part entirely conscious of it the whole time we were together. I liked what I knew, and I liked that there was more to know, and obviously I hoped to learn it or experience it, and I was besotted or confused enough to assume that knowing so would only strengthen my attachment. And since I never did find out, I don't think this belief ever waned. But that didn't particularly matter, for I had, I suppose, in the common vernacular, or typical use of the phrase, fallen in love with, madly, deeply, stupidly, wonderfully, whatever adverb you prefer, in love with him. And of course this was motivated primarily by the deep joy. That's not really the right word, for it was more than that, or at least it was something in addition to joy, the exquisite contentment his presence imparted on me, so much so, that is, that in the moments, or really hours or even days following our parting, I would, unless otherwise distracted, devote my attention to his presence, to the pleasure of our encounter, and it is here, and in this way, that I actually fell in love. By reflecting upon my pleasure, and then considering that reflection, and so on, I constructed a relationship almost entirely in my mind, built through my desire and the thought of its consummation, not necessarily in any physical sense, but very much in the unambiguous reciprocation of every thought, every wish I had in these moments. I fell in love with him in my mind, and almost entirely there at that, for I was too busy being with him to convince myself of his worth whenever we were together. And it's not hard to stay in your own mind. There's always so much to confront it, that to simply retrench and consider yourself immune to attrition seems, or then seemed, the best possible reaction, even as the summer wore down and we met less frequently, and I knew full well that soon we would not meet at all, unless by some strange occurrence we did. I've always loved Toronto and considered it my home. I suppose that was inevitable, as I've lived here all my life and rarely traveled when I was young. Either that or I'd grow to hate it and move to New York or Paris or some other city cosmopolitan enough in reputation to warrant escaping to. Although I always fancied myself quite the iconoclast, and if so inclined might have instead chosen to hide away in a small town of apparently limited desirability, like Pierre, South Dakota. That's the state capital, I believe. It's a funny name for a city.
And?
Oh, nothing. It just feels strange to be on a first-name basis with a geographical unit. Flin Flon's a funny name, too, and it straddles the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, so if ever bored with one province, I could quite easily move to the other, if only ephemerally, although the petty chauvinist in me questions whether either would be an improvement.
I don't think anyone will appreciate you belittling so much of Canada. It's very nice out there, in some places, although I don't like the weather.
Where are you from?
Hamilton?
Well, then I can see why you might be defensive.
It wasn't always like that.
No, it was not. But nor was that what motivated my crack. I do empathize, though, in general, if not in specifics. I didn't want to leave Toronto, not then and not now, which is not to say that I didn't wish to travel, because of course I did, and I did travel, eventually, quite a bit, as you know, but always on the assumption that I would return, and if the city changed in the interim, it was no more than I myself did, and certainly nothing I couldn't then acclimate to, if given enough time and allowed enough effort. And I suppose I assumed he felt that way too, for he too was from Toronto and he grew up here as I did, though like most he was born somewhere else. I figured that everyone I knew and liked and thought I had some sort of connection with had the same relationship to the city as I did. More bluntly, it never even occurred to me that he wouldn't stay in Toronto, even though he had never intended to remain past the summer and had probably mentioned this God knows how many times beforehand. But I never heard him, and so when he made it explicit, when he said as much, that now was the end, I was hurt as though he had made his decision on the spot, in full defiance of, no, to directly spite everything I had felt that I had experienced to that point. I took it personally, in other words, because it was personal, though not in the way you'd assume. Of course I didn't tell him this, because there was no point, or so I thought, and in hindsight there's really even less of one. We saw each other a few more times, maybe only once actually, and it wasn't as pleasant, not for me at least, and obviously that was all I thought about. How pleasant will this be for me? And since I concluded understandably, not very, I thought day and night or long and hard or whatever about what I was to do or what I should do, thinking there must be some sort of moral imperative stuck in here somewhere, as in there was a right and a wrong, and I was determined to take the former and act chivalrously, only I had no idea as to what that entailed, and again only hoped, I suppose, that once more my self-sacrifice would be so great as to warrant the self-pitying that was sure to follow. So I said nothing, and I did nothing. Inaction is always the most tempting solution to any problem, and it certainly seemed the right decision at the time. Briefly, that is, as in those final moments when we said goodbye and assured each other that we would keep in touch and afforded ourselves one final bit of mild intimacy. Nobody cried, at least, which I was proud of then, and in a way am still proud of now. Maybe he did after we parted. A certain stoicism was still expected of men, but I rather doubt it. I mean, I hoped for it, sort of, on the thought that then he too would have thought of me as I did him, but then, at the same time, I knew how terrible I myself felt, and would not have dared wish that upon him or anyone else. And moreover, had he felt that way, it would have raised the question as to why we had both proven so stupidly inert in our actions beforehand, and then I certainly would have cried, for there are few things in life sadder than stupidity. We spoke, not literally really, but through emails and the like, a few times afterward, but that was about it. I committed myself, eventually, to seeking someone else, on the assumption that this was the healthy, or at the very least expected thing to do. It did take a long time, though, as every time I thought about it or felt the opportunity present itself, I thought it dishonest to pursue it further, like I'd be secretly cuckolding him if I kissed someone on New Year's Eve or found Gene Kelly attractive in It's Always Fair Weather. I knew it was rather absurd, too, but I thought it romantic, probably, or at least convinced myself that the absurd often was romantic, and what I wanted more than anything was romance, or romance, since of course I couldn't then and probably still can't tell you what that means, objectively or to myself. Still, I tried,
But always in the back of my head was that terrible voice, accompanied by a selection of ever-changing, ever more beautiful images telling me that once I truly was in love, and perhaps he was too, and maybe one day he would return like a knight in shining armor, and I'd see him, and should that happen, I'd hate it if I were already committed elsewhere, and I'd hate what I know I'd do to whomever that unlucky man happened to be. Well, this never happened, as you know, and in a very short period of time we fell out of contact. I guess it wouldn't have been very hard to reach out to him. In fact, it would have been rather easy, mechanically speaking, but I never did, and he didn't either. Eventually, after a much longer period of time, I more vigorously reasserted my presence, if you will, among the eligible young bachelors of my generation, but even without the misplaced guilt or self-serving chivalrous affectations of before, I always found myself disappointed, asking the same old question. So I stopped and devoted my time, or really the time I would have spent on things like these, and I want to make that distinction because otherwise it sounds as though I spent my everyday wistfully reminiscing or impotently shaking my fist at the sky, to other things equally important to me, and I don't for a second regret that. I don't know what happened to him, and though I obviously wondered on occasion, I never thought to find out. I had moved on, to the best of my ability, or for the best, or in the manner I think best suited me. I guess it's quite probable he knows what became of me. And I think he remained with me, anyway, in much the same way as he always did, more a creation of my own imagination, a beautiful ideal than actual tangible love. And I continue to, cherish this, the stubborn individuality of it. My one romance again in quotation marks, is most accurately that, one, single. It was unique, in other words, or unique to me, as an experience and as an emotion, and I never could relinquish that feeling, or cheapen it through duplication. So I'm here today, and I still maintain it, and I tell it to those who ask, because I told it once and people were interested, and others insist it plays an important part in my work, and still others seem in need of the advice, though admittedly this last reason might be more of a projection on my part than a demonstrable truth. And throughout he, the young man I loved, or have since always claimed to have loved, is transformed into a character, a literary construct, though of course he always was one, in a way. So I think it important, no essential, to note with great emphasis that he was not a character, but a real person, and likely a far more important person in his life to himself and others too than he ever was to me, and so I feel obligated to add what I felt then, or rather hoped, and continue to hope now and hope once more publicly, should he ever see this, and always return to whenever I thought it best to think of someone other than myself, that I never asked that he love me in return, or think of me as I did him, even as I wanted it, or that he even had to speak to me, which of course he never did. No, what I hoped was that he knew, should he ever feel sad or dejected, heartbroken or upset, mistreated or worthless, or any of those other inevitable and unenviable emotions, that there was at least one person out there who cared deeply about him, and thought the world of him, and would proudly assert this to anyone who asked, and prove so convincing and so sincere that any other detractor would be forced to recant, and indeed apologize, for it would be true, and no one could say otherwise.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's all.